you're probably paying more in taxes than a billionaire. Not in total dollars, obviously, but as a percentage of what you earn. If you make more than $45,000 a year working a regular job, congratulations, you're paying a higher tax rate than some of the richest people on Wall Street, not because you're doing something wrong, because they're doing something perfectly legal, something that has a name so obscure most Americans have never heard of it. It's called carried interest, and it's costing the federal government somewhere between $14 and $18 billion every single year. That's billion with a B, and here's the part that should make your blood boil. Every single president for the last 2 decades has promised to close this loophole, and every single one of them has failed. This isn't a conspiracy theory. This is public record. This is documented in Congressional Budget Office reports, Senate Finance Committee testimony, and regulatory filings that anyone can access. But the reason you've probably never heard of carried interest is because the people who benefit from it have spent over $600 million in the last decade alone, making sure it stays exactly as it is. $600 million in campaign contributions and lobbying, not to create jobs, not to fund innovation, but to preserve a tax break that lets investment managers pay half the rate that nurses, teachers, firefighters, and construction workers pay on their income. Let that sink in for a moment. The system isn't broken by accident. It was designed this way. And what comes next will show you exactly how deep this goes. Let's start with a name you might recognize, Stephen Schwarzman. He's the founder and CEO of Blackstone, the world's largest private equity firm. In 2022, Schwarzman took home $1.27 billion. That's not a typo. $1,270 million in a single year. Now, you'd assume someone making that kind of money would be paying the top federal tax rate, right? 37%, same as any other high earner. But here's where it gets interesting. A massive chunk of Schwarzman's annual income comes from something called carried interest. And instead of paying 37% on that money, he pays 20%, the capital gains rate. The same rate you'd pay if you sold some stocks you'd been holding for a few years. Except Schwarzman isn't selling his own stocks. He's managing other people's money and taking a cut of the profits. That's his job. That's his salary. But the tax code lets him pretend it's an investment gain. Here's how it works. Private equity firms, hedge funds, and venture capital funds operate on what's called the 2 and 20 model. They charge their investors a 2% management fee on all assets under management, which gets taxed as ordinary income. Fair enough. But then they also take 20% of any profits they generate. And that 20% cut is called carried interest. Under current law, as long as the investments are held for at least 3 years, that carried interest is taxed as a long-term capital gain. 20% instead of 37%. Now, on paper, the argument is that this incentivizes risk-taking and long-term investment. But here's the problem. The fund managers aren't risking their own money. They're managing other people's money, pension funds, insurance companies, university endowments, wealthy individuals. The risk belongs to the investors. The fund managers are just doing their job. And for that job, they're getting a preferential tax rate that most Americans will never, ever see. Let's put this in perspective. If you're a married couple filing jointly and you make $200,000 a year, you're paying a 22% marginal tax rate on a big chunk of that income. If you're single and making the same amount, you're paying 24%. These are people who might be doctors, small business owners, senior engineers, experienced traders. They're doing well, but they're not billionaires, and yet they're paying a higher effective rate on their labor than a hedge fund manager who pulls down $50 million a year managing other people's portfolios. It's not a bug in the system. It's a feature, and the people who benefit from it have fought like hell to keep it that way. Donald Trump promised to eliminate the carried interest loophole, not once, but repeatedly. During his 2016 campaign, he called it ridiculous. He said the hedge fund guys were getting away with murder. He said they were shifting paper around and getting lucky while paying nothing in taxes. His exact words, "We will eliminate the carried interest deduction and other special interest loopholes that have been so good for Wall Street investors and for people like me, but unfair to American workers." That was candidate Trump in 2016. Then he became President Trump. And in 2017, when his administration passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the most comprehensive tax overhaul in decades, carried interest survived completely intact. Well, not completely. They made one tiny change They increased the holding period from 1 year to 3 years before carried interest could qualify for the lower capital gains rate. But here's the kicker. Most private equity deals are held for 5 to 7 years anyway, so the change was meaningless. It was a cosmetic fix designed to look like action while preserving the loophole for the people who mattered. And Trump wasn't the first. Barack Obama promised to close it. Hillary Clinton promised to close it during her campaign. Joe Biden talked about closing it. In 2022, Democrats tried to include a provision to eliminate carried interest in the Inflation Reduction Act, their landmark climate and healthcare bill. It was in the draft. It was part of the plan, and then it got stripped out. Why? Because one senator objected. Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, who at the time was a Democrat, refused to support the bill if it included any provision that raised taxes on corporations or wealthy Americans. So they pulled it. $14 billion in potential revenue over 10 years, gone. Because one person said no. And the private equity industry had spent a lot of money making sure that person would say no. This is where the story gets darker, because it's not just about campaign contributions, although those are staggering. The private equity and hedge fund industries have donated almost $600 million to political campaigns over the last decade. That's not money going to mom and pop investors or middle-class savers. That's money going to preserve a tax advantage that benefits a tiny sliver of the population. According to Americans for Financial Reform, between 2018 and 2020, the top 5 private equity firms alone received $15 billion in carried interest income, not revenue. Carried interest specifically, and that income was taxed at rates far below what ordinary workers pay. The Congressional Budget Office has estimated that closing the loophole would raise somewhere between $12 and $18 billion over a decade, depending on how it's structured. Some estimates go higher, but even at the low end, that's money that could fund infrastructure, education, healthcare, deficit reduction. Instead, it's subsidizing the compensation of people who are already among the wealthiest in the country. Stephen Schwarzman is a particularly illuminating case study. Back in 2010, when Congress was seriously considering closing the carried interest loophole, Schwarzman made headlines for comparing the effort to the Nazi invasion of Poland. Yes, really. He said it was like war. He later apologized, but the sentiment was clear. Any attempt to touch carried interest would be met with total scorched earth resistance. And it worked. The effort failed. Schwarzman kept his tax advantage, and over the years, he's accumulated a net worth that Forbes now estimates at over $40 billion. He's donated hundreds of millions to philanthropic causes, funded scholarships, endowed university programs, all admirable. But it's worth asking, how much of that wealth was accumulated thanks to a tax code that lets him pay a lower rate on his primary income than a firefighter pays on theirs? Here's the term that keeps coming up in Senate testimony and policy papers: tax alchemy. That's what carried interest is. It's the magical transformation of compensation income into investment income. In every other context, if you get paid for doing your job, that's ordinary income, taxed at ordinary rates. But if you're a private equity manager, suddenly your compensation isn't really compensation. It's carry, it's an interest in future profits. ND, debt, linguistic sleight of hand is worth billions. The industry argues that carried interest reflects the risk and entrepreneurship involved in private equity. But pension fund managers, university endowments, and other institutional investors have consistently rejected that argument. They're the ones putting up the capital. They're the ones taking the risk. The fund managers are getting paid to deploy that capital effectively. That's a service. And services in the American tax code are supposed to be taxed as income. Now, here's a detail that makes this even more infuriating. The 3-year holding period that Trump's tax bill introduced can be It's technical, but it matters. Fund managers can use something called carry waivers to shift gains from investments sold before the 3-year mark to other investments that will be held longer. It's an accounting trick, and it's perfectly legal. So even the minimal reform that was passed in 2017 has loopholes within the loophole. It's Russian dolls of tax avoidance. And at the center of it all are some of the richest people in the country, paying less per dollar than the people who clean their office. Let's talk about what this costs in human terms. $14 billion a year is a conservative estimate. That's roughly the annual budget of the Environmental Protection Agency. It's twice the budget of the National Science Foundation. It's enough to fund free community college for every student in America. With money left over, instead, It's going uncollected because a small group of financiers convince lawmakers that their compensation should be treated differently than everyone else's. And every year that this continues, the gap widens. Income inequality in America has reached levels not seen since the 1920s. The top 1% now controls more wealth than the entire middle class combined. And tax policy like the carried interest loophole is a big part of why. It's not the only reason, but it's a glaring example of a system that bends the rules for those who can afford to lobby for them. What's remarkable is how bipartisan the opposition to carried interest has become. In theory, Democrats have been trying to close it for years. Republicans, at least in their rhetoric, have supported closing it. Trump claimed he wanted it gone. But when the moment comes, when the bill is being written and the votes are being counted, it survives. Why? Because the people who benefit from it have access, their donors, their advisors. They're connected. Schwarzman himself served on President Trump's Strategic and Policy Forum during his first term. He had a direct line to the White House, and when push came to shove, carried interest stayed in the tax code. In 2025, there's renewed talk of closing the loophole. President Trump, now in his second term, has once again expressed interest in eliminating it. Lawmakers from both parties have introduced bills. Senator Tammy Baldwin introduced the Carried Interest Fairness Act, which would tax carried interest as ordinary income. Congressman Don Bayer introduced a similar bill in the House, and for a moment it looked like there might be momentum. But then the House Ways and Means Committee advanced a tax bill that didn't touch carried interest. Once again, the loophole survived. The private equity industry, through its lobbying arm, the American Investment Council, argued that the existing treatment strikes the right balance and encourages long-term investment. But if you read between the lines, what they're really saying is, we've spent too much money protecting this to let it go now. There's another angle to this story that doesn't get enough attention. Private equity firms have come under fire for how they operate. When a private equity firm buys a company, they often load it with debt, cut costs aggressively, and then flip it for a profit. Sometimes that works. Companies get restructured, become more efficient, and thrive. But other times, it's a disaster. Workers get laid off, wages get cut, benefits disappear. And in some cases, the company collapses entirely under the weight of the debt. Toys R Us is one of the most famous examples. A $6.6 billion private equity buyout left the company drowning in debt, and it eventually filed for bankruptcy. Thousands of workers lost their jobs. The private equity firms walked away having made millions in management fees, and those fees, including carried interest, were taxed at preferential rates. So not only did the workers lose their livelihoods, but the people who engineered the deal paid a lower tax rate on their earnings than those same workers had been paying on their wages. The term carried interest itself has an interesting history. It dates back to the 16th century when ship captains would carry cargo across the ocean and take a 20% cut of the profits from successful deliveries. It was a share of the spoils for taking on the journey. And for centuries, that model made sense in contexts where the person taking the carry was also taking genuine risk. But in modern finance, the risk has been almost entirely separated from the reward. The fund managers aren't captaining their own ships. They're managing fleets owned by other people, and yet they're still getting the captain's share, taxed as if they'd put their own fortunes on the line. There's a broader principle at stake here. Tax policy is supposed to reflect societal priorities. We tax income to fund government services, infrastructure, defense, education, social programs. The theory is that everyone contributes according to their ability. Progressive taxation means that those who earn more pay a higher rate because they can afford to and because they benefit more from the stability and infrastructure that taxes provide. But carried interest flips that logic on its head. It gives the wealthiest earners a discount. And not just any discount, a discount that costs the government billions every year. That money has to come from somewhere. Either it gets made up by other taxpayers or it gets borrowed, adding to the national debt. Either way, ordinary Americans are paying the price for a tax break that benefits a small group of finance. So why does this matter to you? Because every dollar that goes uncollected from carried interest is a dollar that can't be spent on roads, schools, healthcare, or lowering the deficit. It's a dollar that shifts the burden onto everyone else. And it's a perfect illustration of how the system is rigged not in some abstract conspiratorial way, but in a very concrete, documented, legal way. The rules are written by people with access, and those rules benefit the people who wrote them. The carried interest loophole is just one example, but it's a powerful one because it's so blatant, because the amounts are so staggering, and because every attempt to fix it has been blocked by the very people who profit from it. At this point, you might be wondering, if this is so obviously unfair, why hasn't it been fixed? The answer is simple: money, political influence, and the fact that most Americans don't even know the loophole exists. It's complex enough that it doesn't make for good sound bites. It doesn't fit neatly into a 30-second campaign ad. And the people who benefit from it work very hard to keep it obscure. They fund think tanks that publish papers defending it. They hire lobbyists to flood Capitol Hill with arguments about job creation and economic growth. They make campaign contributions to lawmakers on both sides of the aisle, and they wait. Because as long as the public isn't paying attention, the loophole survives. The private equity industry likes to argue that closing the loophole would hurt small businesses and pension funds, but pension fund managers themselves have said that's not true. The people who actually invest in private equity funds, the ones putting up the capital, don't benefit from the carried interest loophole. The fund managers do, the general partners, the people running the show, and those people are already extraordinarily wealthy. Maurice Pearl, the former managing director at BlackRock and now chair of the patriotic Millionaires, has been outspoken on this issue. He's said, and these are his words, that the carried interest loophole is one of the most economically and morally unjustifiable tax breaks that exists. And he's a wealthy person saying this. He's not some radical activist. He's someone who worked on Wall Street and understands how the system operates, and even he thinks it's indefensible. Here's the thing about loopholes. They don't close themselves. They require political will, and political will requires public pressure. The reason carried interest has survived for so long is because most people don't know it exists. And the people who do know either benefit from it or feel powerless to change it. But information is power. Now, you know that billionaires are paying lower tax rates on their primary income than middle-class workers. You know that this costs the government somewhere between $14 and $18 billion a year. You know that every president for the last 2 decades has promised to close it and failed. And you know that the private equity industry has spent over $600 million in the last 10 years, making sure it stays exactly as it is. If you value documentaries that pull back the curtain on the systems that shape our economy, that reveal what's hidden behind the official narratives, this channel exists for exactly that reason. We dig into the financial structures, the political machinery, and the policy decisions that affect your life, even when you don't see them. Because the truth is, most of the biggest decisions that impact ordinary Americans are made in rooms where ordinary Americans aren't present. And the carried interest loophole is one of the clearest examples of that. So here's where we are. In 2025, there's talk of reform. Again, bills have been introduced. Again. And the private equity industry is gearing up to fight it. Again, they've already spent over $700,000 in lobbying in just the first quarter of 2025, according to recent reports. That's not money being spent to improve the economy or create jobs. That's money being spent to preserve a tax advantage. And unless something changes, unless there's real pressure from voters who actually understand what's at stake, the loophole will survive. Again, the carried interest loophole isn't just a tax issue. It's a symbol of a system where the rules are different depending on who you are and who you know. Where wealth doesn't just create opportunity, it creates its own set of laws. And where ordinary people are told to play by one set of rules while the ultra-wealthy play by another. It's legal, it's documented, and it's been hiding in plain sight for decades. The question is, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? Knowing all this, you still think the system is broken by accident, or exactly as it was designed.